People love to watch heavyweight fights simply because there is a far greater chance of seeing a KO, and there have been some incredible heavyweights in MMA over the years, with plenty being able to make a legitimate claim for being the greatest to ever do it. Today we're discussing some of the greatest heavyweights to ever grace the sport of MMA, so stay right where you are. First up, we're talking Alistair Overeem. The Dutch kickboxing legend made the transition to MMA and was the first ever winner of the Strikeforce heavyweight crown. And with a record of 47-19, it's safe to say the Reem has certainly paid his dues. He would fight for UFC gold in 2016, but would, unfortunately, come up against another man on today's list, Stipe Miocic, who at that point was in his prime. But by then, Overeem had basically seen and done it all. At the peak of his powers at the end of the 2000s, Alistair would put together a 12-fight win streak with wins over fellow legends of the game, such as Brock Lesnar, Fabricio Werdum, and Mark Hunt during that time. He would also beat a who's who of MMA royalty during his career, with notable wins over Vitor Belfort twice, JDS, Roy Nelson, and Andrei Arlovski. The Dutchman has since made his way back to kickboxing, where he most recently scored a win over longtime rival Badr Hard in their trilogy bout. Where do you guys rank the Reem? We're talking Fedor next. Stay with us. While many people acknowledge the terrifying Russian, he has never fought in the game's top promotion, and for that reason, many believe he cannot be the GOAT. Of course, that's nonsense, as he is still taking out some of the game's heaviest hitters in other promotions. He would only lose one fight in the first decade of his career and is one of the most well-rounded heavyweights in history. He is just as likely to KO an opponent as he is to submit them, with 16 KOs and 15 submission wins on his record. He has also won titles in multiple different promotions, including Pride, Rings, and WAMA. During the 2000s, Fedor was legitimately the scariest man on the planet, and during the course of his incredible career, he has beaten no fewer than 7 former UFC heavyweight champions. I mean, who needs the UFC with a record like that? Am I right? Cardio Cain is coming through next. Unfortunately for Cain Velasquez, injuries would cut short his fantastic career. But while he was UFC champion, he was one of the best around. He battered Brock Lesnar back in 2010 to win the title for the first time, before winning it back 2 years later against JDS, having lost it to Bigfoot. What made Cain so unique was the pace he would put on his opponents during his fights. Nobody had seen anything like it. Of course, heavyweights are synonymous with an often slow and methodical style, but Velasquez tore up that particular rulebook and forced his opponents into deep water, simply due to his cardio and the pace he would fight at. He also had terrifying power, finishing 12 of his 14 MMA wins via way of knockout. Unfortunately, injuries would catch up with Velasquez. He would be forced to retire after his knockout loss to Francis back in 2019. At present, he is languishing in a California jail awaiting trial after shooting a man linked to another man accused of molesting his daughter. Hopefully, he is acquitted. Where does Cain rank on your list? Next up, we're talking Fabricio Werdum. Stay tuned. The Brazilian is a 4-time BJJ world champion and also held the UFC heavyweight title after unifying the division with a win over Cain Velasquez back in 2015. Probably the best Brazilian jiu-jitsu player in the history of heavyweight MMA. Werdum also holds wins over some of the division's elite, including Fedor, Big Nog, and Mark Hunt. At one point in his career, Werdum seemed like he was destined to become a journeyman-style fighter. He was cut by the UFC in 2008, but after winning 3 out of his 4 fights at Strikeforce, would return to the organization by default after the merger. He decided that this time around he would grab his opportunity with both hands, going on a 6-fight win streak, which culminated in the world title. He propelled himself onto the world scene after ending Fedor Emelianenko's 28-fight unbeaten streak, forcing fellow heavyweights to sit up and notice the new kid on the block. He would also acquire a plethora of new fans after throwing a boomerang at Colby Covington after the welterweight trashed his native Brazil. Were you a Werdum fan? Let us know below. Randy Couture is up next. There's a strong argument which suggests that if it wasn't for Couture, the heavyweight division wouldn't be what it is today. Randy was an absolute pioneer of the sport and won the UFC's heavyweight title on no fewer than 3 separate occasions. Oh, and you can throw in a light heavyweight title for good measure. Had he stayed at heavyweight his entire career, there's a good chance we would be speaking about him as the greatest to ever do it. But he would regularly dip back down to light heavyweight, heavyweight, meaning his versatility and ability to fight at two different weight classes have actually worked against him in the heavyweight GOAT conversation. Couture would become synonymous with his epic battles with Chuck Liddell and Vitor Belfort, but both those fights came in an LWH. At heavyweight, he holds huge wins over Kevin Randleman, Tim Sylvia, and Gabriel Gonzaga. He would also take part in the first ever UFC Hall of Famer versus Hall of Famer fight against Mark Coleman, winning by way of rear naked choke submission. Where does Randy rank for you guys? Stipe is coming through next. Stay with us. Many people's heavyweight GOAT, Stipe Miocic, holds the most heavyweight title defenses in history and has beaten some of the best to ever do it in the process. He holds 2 wins over another GOAT contender, Daniel Cormier. More on him in a bit. And also knocked out former champion Fabricio Werdum in his own backyard to wrestle the belt from him. Stipe would lose his title to Francis Ngannou in their rematch after dominating the current champion in their first fight, but he is still highly ranked in the division, so you can bet your bottom dollar we haven't seen the last of the most successful heavyweight in UFC history just yet. Do you guys think the Ohio man has what it takes to launch another title-winning run? Give us your thoughts below. Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira is joining us now. Minotauro, or Big Nog as he is also known, and not to be confused with his twin brother of the same name, is one of the greatest heavyweights in the history of the fight game, and with a record of 34-10, it's easy to see why. Over a 10-year period at the turn of the century, it's no exaggeration to say that Big Nog was up there with the best on the planet. During that time, he amassed a record of 28-3-1, with those 3 losses coming against fellow legends Fedor Emelianenko and Dan Henderson. Of course, it was his Pride days which were most impressive, but he also appeared in the UFC, capturing the heavyweight division's interim title at the expense of Tim Sylvia. He also holds notable wins over fellow legends and members of this list, including Fabricio Werdum, Fedor, and Randy Couture, as well as Josh Barnett and Mark Coleman, among many, many more. Where do you guys rank Minotauro? And finally, it's DC. Daniel Cormier entered the UFC as a former Strikeforce heavyweight tournament winner, and although known more so for his reign at light heavyweight in the top MMA promotion, he still managed to capture heavyweight gold at the expense of the most successful heavyweight in the promotion's history, Stipe Miocic. The Louisiana native didn't taste defeat in the octagon until 6 years into his MMA career, when he came up against arguably the pound-for-pound greatest John Jones. Of course, he would go on to claim the title in the very next fight, after Jones was stripped for one of his many brushes with the law. DC would come up against Jones again a couple of years later, but that defeat would later be overturned as Jones failed a drugs test. Cormier had long struggled to make the 205-pound limit, so shortly after the Jones fight, he decided to move up to heavyweight, where he instantly became champion after taking on the legendary Miocic. He then submitted Derek Lewis before losing back-to-back fights against the Ohio firefighter, then calling it a career. While DC is probably more synonymous with his light heavyweight run, the fact that he dethroned the best champion the division has ever seen means he easily makes today's list. What did you guys make of Daniel Cormier's career? As always, thanks for dropping in on us today, and remember to tune in again next time when we will be discussing all sorts of other cool bits and pieces. And why not do us a solid by liking and sharing today's video, while also subscribing to our channel so you don't miss out on more great content.